War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 18, Terrorism Case Studies. While terrorism is as old as history, definition dependent, today I want to focus on the post-World War II era. The Cold War can be partially described as a, pardon the expression, golden era of terrorism, with nuclear deterrence keeping the very real existential fight between Western values and communism at a simmer. The use of less than full violence became the norm, what might be phrased as sub-existential violence. The Cold War was, ultimately, a war of information between competing ideologies to garner support from governments and populations to support your own position and undermine your enemies. And terrorism is fundamentally about sending a message. A quick departure. I am writing this script the day after the attempted assassination of former President Trump. Some have questioned, myself included, whether this is, in fact, terrorism. As he was not the sitting president and apparently not killed by a country or entity at war with the United States, the act is not immediately excluded from being terrorism. He is, at the moment, a private citizen seeking political office. He is, despite some unhinged comments by various individuals and groups, a protected person, returning to my working definition of terrorism. Terrorism is violence or the threat of violence directed against protected targets in pursuit of policy objectives. There was unquestionably violence, but was the act in pursuit of policy objectives? While we may never know the motive of the shooter for two reasons, one, he's dead, and two, I doubt the government would tell us if they knew from other sources. If he just wanted to kill a famous person to become famous himself, then not terrorism, the John Hinckley syndrome. If, however, he was motivated to stop Trump from becoming president to ensure Trump did not enact his stated policy objectives, then this act would appear to be an act of terrorism. I don't mean to get all political, but 6 years later, my analysis of Trump's political enemies leads me to believe that some of them think that Trump himself is the source of their political opposition, that his supporters don't particularly care about his policies, rather they have fallen to a cult of personality, and that they support Trump the man versus the policy objectives he states he will enact. If this is true, then the killing of Trump would be a viable and effective use of violence in support of policy objectives. Please note, I did not say legal. Ultimately, the killing of Trump would not serve an informational purpose. Instead, it would be the absolute destruction of the center of gravity of the so-called MAGA movement. It would be final and decisive. However, if Trump is merely a symptom of the response to unpopular policies that Trump opposes, the killing of Trump would serve the informational purpose of threatening others who sought to undermine the current ruling consensus. But then you can't wonder if it would strengthen the position of those who think the current federal government wields too much power, providing the informational warfare unintentionally that would strengthen the MAGA movement and swing towards another leader perhaps even more strident in his beliefs. 2 weeks ago, we discussed the targeting of congressmen as an act of terror. Killing the representative of a popular movement is both terrorism and most likely counterproductive, as there is no reason to think killing the representative would undermine the inherent popularity of his policies. And it introduces a series of unknowns. As a quick example, for decades, Yasser Arafat led the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, one of the world's most infamous terrorist organizations. While several of his deputies were assassinated, presumably by Israel, Arafat himself died a natural death. Some have hypothesized that this was deliberate Israeli policy to deal with the devil they knew, and that by killing his deputies it was messaging to Arafat that, should he go too far, he too would die. And back to the original question. Was the attempted assassination of Trump terrorism? If the shooter was motivated by politics, then yes, as it was unquestionably violence against a protected target. So having addressed that particular issue, let's move on to today's subject. The focus here will be on communist and Islamic terrorism. This does not deny that other ideologies utilize terrorism as a strategy. But these two do dominate the post-war history, for two specific reasons which explain last week's subject and its focus on the development of the nation-state as a source of stability. Terrorism, as a crime, really only works in the context of the nation-state and the legally protected sovereignty of the nation-state over internal affairs. Communism rejects the concept of the nation as a legitimate or inherent concept. Rather than the division of populations by national characteristics such as origin, language, custom, and/or religion, communism divides populations by economic class, which transcends all national boundaries. Communism accepts the concept of state only so far as a means to an end. The end state of communist ideology is a single state of a single economic class. So while the communists insist that state sovereignty apply to those states which are socialist in practice and communist in name, they see zero reason to respect non-communist state sovereignty. Their division of national boundaries into North and South, East and West, as a means to divide the nations of Vietnam, Korea, and Germany, was a tactic to further the revolution. Contrarily, the continuation of the unnatural combination of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia was perfectly acceptable, as they were united as socialist states. As neither nation nor state was inherent, there is no reason to respect the sovereignty of those states. So the use of violence internal to states by proxies in furtherance of international communism was a perfectly acceptable tactic. Conversely, Islamic terrorism is rooted in the rejection of the state, rather the nation of Islam, and subdivided the nation of Araby. The Islamic states we see today rest on the boundaries created by Western European powers during the colonialist era and in the post-World War I carving up of the Ottoman Empire. They carved up the greater Ummah, or Muslim nation, into states often in ignorance or in deliberate malevolence towards the tribal politics which dominated for centuries previously. This led to the instability we still see today. As a brief example of this phenomena, when the State of Israel was created in 1948, the war was phrased as Arab versus Israeli. When Jordan occupied the West Bank after the 1949 armistice, they saw no reason to create a separate Palestinian state, as the concept of subdivision into states made no sense to the great Arab nationalism. Likewise with Gaza and Egypt. The aforementioned PLO was founded in Moscow in 1964, when Gaza and the West Bank were in Arab hands. The organization was led by the Egyptian-born and raised Yasser Arafat. None of this is surprising when understanding that the establishment of a separate Palestinian state was secondary to the reestablishment of the Arab national control of what was considered a simple territory at the time. The banner of Arab nationalism reached its apex when Syria and Egypt were united as a single state called the United Arab Republic for a brief period in the 1960s. So if you reject either part of the nation-state, the use of terrorism against a nation-state becomes a perfectly acceptable tactic. There were innumerable communists-aligned and communist country-sponsored terrorist groups worldwide responsible for countless attacks, mostly in the undeveloped world, but most famously in the developed world. This is not simple slander. Both Lenin and Trotsky open and often advocated for the use of mass terror in support of their revolution. Any tool or tactic which forwarded global communism was acceptable. The fact that terrorism, by definition, harms protected targets, usually innocent civilians, these organizations often attract not so much committed communists, so much as murderous psychopaths who should be committed. Their grand strategy is crystal clear: a global communist government. Their tactic, the killing of innocent civilians and the terrorizing of others through these acts, is likewise clear. But the linkage between these is somewhat murky. They often couch their acts in terms of bringing awareness to the struggle, but it is unclear how, exactly, people would have forgotten global communism exists. In some countries, the communist position is simply unpopular and therefore weak. These acts of terrorism could be construed as simply a demonstration of disproportionate power, or that acquiescence to some of the policy prescriptions would be the necessary price to stop the violence should law enforcement be unable to crush the terrorist group. In Northern Ireland, notably but not uniquely, there were two groups with unclear demarcation that sought roughly the same policies, albeit utilizing different tactics. The political wing, Sinn Féin, and the armed wing, the Irish Republican Army. The history of the IRA and the entire Irish independence movement is rich and deep, and the point here is that you can have a political group create adopt, or usurp a terrorist wing to apparently disassociate themselves from the violence, while indirectly supporting it and still benefiting from the violence and terror that particular wing creates. Often, the messaging of the terrorist act is to simply encourage people to not support the enemy of the terrorist organization. This is often found during an insurgency or civil war. As the objective of communism is global domination, the grand strategy of the global communist movement often relied upon civil wars and insurgencies to overthrow the existing non-communist government, to be replaced with a communist government. Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, China, and countless other examples exist. Here, the communist insurgents quickly defined as those who seek to overthrow the existing government, would be advertised as nationalist movements fighting the puppets of imperialism. Not always an inaccurate definition, it neglected the obvious point that the insurgent wanted to replace imperialist stooges with communist stooges. Hat tip to Dr. Strangelove. As any country not openly communist and working with other communist countries invariably fell into this category. Many insurgents worked with communist governments to support their own insurgency that migrated as required to maintain support. What we call Islamic terrorism today was originally Arab and Iranian nationalist terrorism when the Soviet Union openly supported them. Back to Yasser Arafat. He spoke in terms of revolution, not Islam, to some audiences, and at other times focused much more on the Islamic side of revolution. The famous Entebbe hijacking, as well as the Munich massacre, was a coordinated effort between European communist terrorist groups and PLO offshoots. Likewise, the Lod Airport massacre was a coordinated effort between Arab terrorists and Japanese communists. What Japanese communists hoped to obtain through killing tourists in Israel is unclear. Often these groups justified their actions through the simple idea that if you aren't a communist, we will kill you, so become a communist. The competing slogans of better red than dead and better dead than red reflect this. At best, the incessant use of terrorism by communists and nationalists was pure terror, instilling the message that no matter who you are, we will kill you if you don't join our movement. It was largely, but not entirely, ineffective in retrospect. So while terrorism, by my definition, demands a policy objective, this can often be nothing more than the gain of power by an individual or group, and the cause is simply a means of motivating groups to join, to generate combat power. The ultimate spirit of communism is, frankly, greed and self-gain. That others have more, and through communist revolution, your material gains will increase as you take from others through redistribution. Which is why communism as a motivational ideology was more successful in the undeveloped and developing world than in the West, in contravention of Marxist theory. As terrorism is primarily an arm of informational warfare through messaging, the motivating spirit behind the terrorism and its target is of supreme importance. And here Islam has proven a far more effective means of generating and maintaining combat power. While it is not too difficult to counter the materialistic message of communism, which never actually enriches the individual communist, merely the leaders of the revolution, in Islam the promises are made by Allah through the Quran and are impossible to refute. So to return to an earlier episode where I discussed how wars are fought for 4 reasons, 2 of them the leaderships and 2 of them the ground fighters. The example of the Civil War was Lincoln to preserve the Union, but the average Union soldier fighting to free the enslaved. In Islamic-based fighting, and terrorism being a subset of that, the leadership can be said to be fighting for a more Islamic-based government, led by them naturally, whereas the foot soldiers can be seen fighting for Allah and the chance of martyrdom. But this is overly simplistic. At each level of leadership, each fights for both, but in varying degrees. Quite obviously, Osama bin Laden and the various other key leaders associated with Islamic terrorism were not eager to be martyrs. In fact, they did everything to avoid dying. And yet you cannot dismiss entirely the idea that martyrdom played some part in their chosen role. Likewise, while the suicide bombers on 9/11 obviously wanted to die as martyrs, you have to accept that at some level their motivation was to give the information ammunition to their leadership that would allow them to generate combat power to counter the ruling Saud family. To more accurately state, there may be several reasons why someone is fighting or choosing to lead their nation to war. And you must choose to mass your informational attack on these motivations at the one most important, or at least the one most vulnerable, and that this messaging must match the audience. Are you attacking the soldiers, the people, or the leadership? If all 3 are primarily motivated by the same thing, messaging will be exceedingly difficult. But when the three are substantially different, this fact alone can create a seam that can and should be exploited. And on this note, we must address the most famous terrorist attack in modern history, 9/11. While America was the target of the attack, the target of the message was the Muslim Ummah, or community, and more specifically, the Arab masses from whence the attackers and al-Qaeda came from. The leadership of the various Arab nations have long attacked and blamed the West for their nation's ills, while, quite obviously, still working closely with them. This creates a vulnerability for the Arab leadership that al-Qaeda sought to exploit. The attacks themselves, from a purely strategic viewpoint, were brilliant. They attacked all the levers of American power simultaneously. The World Trade Center being economic, the Pentagon being military, and the thwarted attack on Congress being diplomatic, or political if you prefer in this instance. The attacks themselves combine at the center of gravity of informational warfare. Osama bin Laden's popularity in the Muslim world exploded, pardon the expression, following the attack, and his ability to generate combat power was exponentially increased accordingly. The ends was to establish al-Qaeda as the preeminent Islamic leadership of the Ummah. The means were the attacks. The ways was by showing strength against American power. The inability to follow up and achieve their grand strategy of replacing the House of Saud as the leaders of the Arab world, notwithstanding, the attacks of 9/11 were brilliantly planned and executed. President Bush's forceful counterattacks, even on questionable causes, can be seen as a policy counter to al-Qaeda's show of strength. A final quick case study of the effectiveness of terrorism is shown by the Madrid train bombings on 11 March 2004. These attacks took place only 3 days before Spanish elections. Spain had joined the coalition that invaded Iraq and removed Saddam Hussein. The Spanish population was not particularly supportive after a year of endless criticisms against the motivations behind the invasions. The opposition government, behind by several points prior to the bombings, openly campaigned on a policy of withdrawing all Spanish troops from Iraq. In all, 193 people were killed and 2,000 wounded by the Muslim attackers who may or may not have been affiliated with al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda took credit for the bombings regardless. In the end, the bombings directly changed the trajectory of the elections. The socialists won, with millions of voters saying explicitly that the terrorist attacks made them change their vote. The new socialist government in Spain quickly withdrew all Spanish forces, and here was a pure distillation of terrorism working. The division between the government's policy and the people's desires was exploited to nearly pinpoint effect, and the precise policy objectives of the terrorists were achieved in one day of terror in Spain. Terrorism and its tactics are yet another subject worth a deeper dive at a later time. But what terrorist attacks would you like analyzed from a doctrinal perspective? Please let me know. And join me next week when I discuss perhaps the most famous, and I'll say overstated strategy, that of the indirect approach. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit, and check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.